Hi, I'm Akela Reason. I'm not Sylvia Yount, who is, I'm sorry? Sylvia's son had his first orchestra concert rescheduled for tonight and was not able to make it, but I'm going to talk about Samuel Morse's painting in her stead. I work in the American Art Department with Sylvia, and I have a PhD in art history from the University of Maryland, where I've worked on artists like Thomas Eakins and John Vanderlyn. I have a couple of announcements before I start. The Education Department has a couple of programs coming up for the week between Christmas and New Year's, December 26th through 31st. There's going to be a hands-on for the holidays program scheduled for the Green Family Education Center, and there'll be jazz piano music in the Wheelam Pavilion during that week as well. So these are week-long events. Now, today I'm going to talk about, and I'm sorry, this is a little bit dark, the painting is much brighter, but this shows you a bit more detail than some of the other slides that I have. I'm going to talk to you about a painting by Samuel FB Morse called The Gallery of the Louvre, which is on view right now in our special exhibition, Kings as Collectors, in the Chambers, Ancock's Chambers wing. Samuel FB Morse is an American artist who was born in Charlestown, Massachusetts, and died in New York City. He was born in 1791, and he died in 1872. Lived a fairly long life, began his career as an artist, but ultimately is best known for the Morse code, which he developed, which he abandoned art, in part because of this painting, in the 1830s, and began working on the telegraph, and gave up on art altogether. Earlier in his career, he had been very idyllic and wanted to pursue the fine arts. His father was a minister, and Morse went and attended Yale University, and then returned to the Boston area, where he met the artist Washington Alston. This is a self-portrait of the somewhat youthful Morse, and we'll see that he is actually figured in the painting, The Gallery of the Louvre, a little bit later on. So this fairly young man, Morse, comes back from college, goes to Boston, and meets up with the painter Washington Alston, who is a little bit older than Morse, but a very talented young man who decides he's come back recently from Italy with tales of all of the great European art that he has seen on his travels. So he fills Morse's head with all of these tantalizing descriptions of these paintings that he's seen on his recent grand tour. And the two of them decide that they want to go back to Europe together. And Alston really becomes kind of a mentor to Morse. Alston becomes a kind of de facto teacher to Morse. In this time period, early in American history, it's very difficult for an American artist to try to attain an education as an artist in the United States. There are a handful of institutions that are attempting to form in this period, but most of them are pretty fledgling, don't have money, resources, and don't generally have organized classes. At best, some of these institutions may have collections of casts of ancient Greek sculptures or copies, actually, of European paintings or prints that artists have access to and can study from. But the idea of organized courses and training in the fine arts is not really a major possibility for American artists. So they, in this period, turn to Europe as the primary place to acquire their training. And there are a couple places that they can go. They can go to Italy on the Grand Tour, just as Alston had done, and study mostly Italian paintings and Greek and Roman sculpture. You could go to France, but France had just gone through a fairly turbulent period, and many of the younger artists were kind of staying away from France. There were a handful of people who did decide to go. John Vanderlyn is one of them. and he developed a kind of French neoclassical style. What Alston and Morse decide to do is a more typical plan for American artists in this period, and that is they went to England. And they went to England in part following in the footsteps of a great Philadelphia painter, Pennsylvania painter, Benjamin West. Benjamin West, there are all sorts of stories about his youthful development, but he supposedly sketched from when he was quite young, a child, and made his own brushes, learned from Native Americans how to paint. He had all these sort of elaborate stories about how he was able to ultimately attain skill as an artist as a young man. And a collection had been taken up by some wealthy Philadelphia citizens, some gentlemen who decided to help out this young man who had talent and sent him to England. And Benjamin West became one of the most famous artists in England. He became actually the president of the Royal Academy, succeeding Joshua Reynolds, who was a British artist of great talent. So this American actually became basically a British man and headed the greatest one of the greatest European academies at the time. And because all of these American artists had fairly limited opportunities in the United States, they really looked to Benjamin West as being a fellow American who had made good and wanted to go and study with him. So many of these Americans went to England and studied either privately with West or at the Royal Academy in London. And Alston and Morse went to do just that. They went and they became friends and intimates of Benjamin West. And also because Alston was a little bit older than Morse, Alston took Morse under his wing and taught him techniques that he had learned, particularly from Italian painting. And this is a painting by Washington Allston a bit earlier in his career, which is very evocative of kind of the Italian landscape. It's sort of a made-up scene, but it looks very European, very old world. Now, Benjamin West had become known as the American Raphael for his drawing. And Alston, because he was very interested in color and kind of moody atmospheric effects, tried to cultivate the idea that he was the American Titian. And so Alston really had a very deep attachment to Italian painting, and that influenced Morse when he painted the gallery of the Louvre. So Morse and Alston go off to England, and Morse trains there, and then Morse decides to go and continue traveling onto the continent, and he goes and travels to Italy, passing briefly through Paris and stopping at the Louvre on his way south. He makes a fairly brief trip in 1830 to the Louvre and decides at that moment that when he returns, he wants to make a great painting featuring other paintings from the Louvre's great galleries. So he heads down to Italy, and he travels around actually for a year before he gets back to France. And I just have these two paintings here, one by Alston and one by Morse. One is our painting upstairs in the galleries in the Stent Wing by Morse, which we're very fortunate to have. It's a very rare painting that remained in the Morse family and fortunately came to us fairly recently, which shows Morse's first wife and their two children in this picture. And then the one by Alston, just to show you, while traveling throughout Italy, Alston had developed this very moody style, very soft tones, lots of sfumato and Italian effects. And Morse tried to integrate that into his own technique from a study of Alston's work. But then he goes to Europe and he actually sees European painting. And this is a very famous painting called The Tribuna of the Uffizi by Johann Zoffany, who worked in England. And this is a very typical kind of painting of, there was a penchant for painting these images of great galleries and making these kind of capriccio pictures, which were not exactly replicas of the works of art in the galleries, but they were sort of fantasies that included some works from these galleries. and also generally portraits of very famous connoisseurs. And Zoffany was working in England, and it was possible that Morse could have seen a painting like this, which is now in the royal collections. But this was a type of painting that would have been known to him, and he would have, on his travels to Italy, seen a lot of the works that are actually well-known and featured here, such as Titian's Venus of Urbino, which is right here. And then there's a host of classical sculptures that have been also brought into this room, crowding it far more than actually the Uffizzi's Tribuna actually was. And each of these men here is actually a portrait of individual connoisseurs who wanted to be depicted, showing their knowledge about painting. So through his travels in Italy and his connections to essentially British painting like this, Morse had decided that he wanted to do a great painting of the Louvre's galleries. And this is more in keeping with the colorations of the painting, although it's a bit out of focus, it looks like, a bit blurry. And what Morse did was he created a slightly more ordered type of painting, similar to Zoffany's Tribuna of the Uffizi, which shows paintings in the Louvre's Salon Carré with a view into the Louvre's galleries, and with a series of little sort of groupings of figures dispersed throughout the composition, most of them copying paintings, because that was what many Americans did to earn their keep, actually, in Europe, was that they made paintings that were copies after European masters to be sold to other Americans, largely because Americans really admired European art, but they knew that they didn't quite have the sophistication to make sure that they were really buying an actual Italian Renaissance painting. A lot of Americans had by unscrupulous European dealers. So in order to sort of make sure that authenticity was not an issue, they very often paid American artists to copy some of the great masters' paintings so that they would have an authentic replica and not a second or third-rate Italian painting that was not worth much. So Morse actually made a lot of copies while he was at the Louvre and while he was in Italy, which he sold for profit. And the other artists who are here in the gallery are working from the paintings on view and making copies for sale. And there's a man right here who is painting with a turban on his head, and he does not actually seem to be copying any specific painting, but he is painting in the galleries. There's a cluster here, which I'll return to in a little bit, of it's a woman seated at an easel with two people behind her, a man and a woman. There's a woman working on a drawing here with a man leaning over her shoulder, and a woman here who is making a miniature of one of the paintings at a little desk. Now, the paintings that Morse featured in his image were not actually the paintings that were in that gallery. And there are not very clear records as to what was in that gallery at that point, but we do have this painting by a French artist from roughly 1831, which is around the time that Morse was there, showing what paintings were in those galleries. And we know that the galleries were designated as galleries for contemporary French painting, which is not what Morse shows. And in fact, in his writings, Morse reviles more contemporary French painting as being violent, bloody, and disgusting. And one of the paintings that he would certainly have been referring to would have been this painting, The Raft of the Medusa, which would have been in the gallery in a very prominent position, which is a very kind of gory, violent image about a great disaster that had happened in France. So this was the sort of painting that did not at all appeal to Morse. And instead, he focused on Italian Renaissance and Baroque masters, also some Spanish school pictures, a few Flemish pictures, a few Dutch pictures, but mostly Renaissance and Italian images, and a very strong focus on Italian painting. And there is one surviving example of a copy that Morse made specifically for the Gallery of the Louvre, which is this painting by Titian of Francis I. He made this small replica, which is only about 8 by 10 inches. And you'll see the painting is painted in here in the final work. Now, Morse did some of this painting actually at the Louvre, and supposedly crowds gathered around him while he was working. He painted over the course of a year. He did much of it in Paris, but he left certain details like the figures and also the frames of the paintings, he said, he saved until he returned home. And the main thing that he concentrated on were sort of capturing the likenesses of the individual paintings. And one of the things that Morse felt that he was doing very strongly was demonstrating his virtuosity as an artist in being able to mimic in miniature the styles of all of these great masters, and particularly the great masters that his mentor Allston had admired, these Italian masters. And you can see some of the paintings in here. We've got some Italian images, Guido Reni, you've got Peter Paul Rubens here, and this woman seated and working diligently in the galleries. If things were difficult for the American artists in general to get an education, it was doubly difficult for women, because the one thing that women were absolutely forbidden to do was to see nude models, which was the basis for a lot of the art training in Europe. So women were barred from all of the life classes at the major schools, and in fact were not really admitted to any of the schools at this time. So women, in order to earn a living, if they had some artistic talent, very often turned to copying and selling their copies, or also simply learning from the old masters by copying their paintings. So that's what's going on in this image, this detail. Then in this corner, which was on the left side of the painting, we have a cluster of figures. And Morse was very good friends with the writer James Fenimore Cooper. And it is generally believed that this is a grouping of Cooper's family, this being Cooper pontificating about art. He had very decided opinions about painting and sculpture, and his wife here, and his daughter, Susan, who actually studied with Morse while she was in Paris. Actually, the two overlapped. Morse and Cooper spent a lot of time together looking for paintings in old junk shops and things while they were in Paris. So this is usually identified as the Cooper family. So Morse may have one of his pupils actually in the painting. And this figure here is usually identified as Morse himself, who has painted himself into this image, leaning over the shoulder of another female pupil and commenting on her drawing and offering her instruction. This one-on-one instruction is really kind of the only way that Americans were able to help each other. Now, what Morse was trying to do in the overall painting was not just show his skill at being able to mimic all these different styles, but what he had hoped to produce was a painting that he could send on tour. And in America, there were a few artists who had been very successful at staging these for-profit exhibitions, where they would paint a very large-scale painting and then rent out rooms and charge admission to come and see those paintings. And this painting was on a scale where Morse thought that he could make a good deal of money from this. And the first place he tried to exhibit it was in New York City, where he had actually helped found what became a great American academy, the National Academy of Design in New York, which became a place for students to learn and to train in the fine arts, but really was a very fledgling institution in these years. But it was something that was in the back of Morse's mind, that students might actually see this picture. So he wanted to make a profit with the general public, demonstrate his virtuosity as a painter, and also perhaps educate other students who did not have an opportunity to travel to the old world and see all of these paintings. They could see them in miniature in his work. And his placement of himself as an instructor right in the center of the painting kind of reinforces this idea of passing on this knowledge. But unfortunately, when Morse exhibited this painting, it was a dismal disaster. This is a quote from the artist William Dunlop, who was also kind of a biographer and writer, critic on the arts. And he wrote, "Every artist and connoisseur was charmed with it, but it was caviar to the multitude." Morse had not selected a particularly saleable topic to try to attract a mass audience to attend his exhibition of this painting. Many Americans did not necessarily want to have their taste elevated. They wanted to see fairly sensational pictures. And some of the pictures that they paid money to see, on average, were scenes that depicted Indians killing white captives and these sort of gory, exciting, kind of titillating images, or nude figures. But this was not the sort of thing that the average person was going to come and see. This was really something for the connoisseur. And though connoisseurs came, they did not spend enough money. The admissions were not high enough for for Morse to even be able to pay for his rooms. So the venture was a real wash, and Morse became so horribly discouraged by this effort that he made, which he thought would be really well received and admired. He was so discouraged by it that he actually gave up on painting. And in the 1830s, he turned more towards his inventions. Initially, he became interested in photography. In 1839, he met Daguerre and saw his invention and became one of the first promoters of photography in the United States, which if you go up to the second floor galleries in the Stent Wing to see our Morse painting, there is a daguerreotype exhibited near it because he was one of those advocates of technology. And he also later went on to invent the telegraph, which is where he made his fortune. And he was very bitter about his artistic career and rarely painted. He painted some images of his family after he essentially gave up the arts. But he wrote, sadly, "My life of poetry and romance is gone," and turned to these commercial ventures, which made his reputation but did not make him happy. And that's it. I'd love to take any questions that you have. I believe Ashley will be coming around with the microphone. They're recording, so that's why she needs to use the microphone. Just a second. Yeah.
Hi, I have a three-part question.
Sure.
What would the gallery, the Louvre and other galleries' policy be towards bringing in paint and easel and setting up shop? Was there an admission fee, and what was the light source in the gallery?
In many of the galleries, there was natural light, to start with the last question. And it was spotty, though, because it was relying on skylights. And also, if it was a sunny day, it was really brilliant. But if it was not a sunny day, it was pretty poor. Also, you could see from Morse's painting, which, though not accurate in terms of what was in those galleries, was typical of the style that paintings were hung in. So there were certain paintings that you could see really well at eye level, and then there were others that were way up high that you could not see at all, or that had glare on them from the incoming light. In order to paint pictures at many of the great picture galleries in Europe, you had to register to be a copyist, and you needed to generally have someone sort of vouch for you that you were actually a legitimate artist, and you could come in and set up your paint and easels without any problems. Some institutions still do it. Not many, but some do. Lauren, Mr. Friedlander has a question.
Were the galleries that you projected there, were they in the Louvre, or where were they?
They were in the Louvre, yes.
Okay,
yes, they were the actual galleries. He just rearranged the paintings.
Where is that painting now?
The Gallery of the Louvre painting, that is in, it's owned by the Terra Foundation. It was actually in private hands for a long time, then it was owned by Syracuse University, and then in the 80s, Daniel Terra, who was a big collector, purchased it for his museum, which has recently closed and is now merged with the Art Institute of Chicago. And that painting is on view here in the Chambers Wing.
Just a second.
You mentioned the role of women during this time, at least for them to be educated in the schools was very difficult. Yet there was a scene there where a woman was actually, it looked like being taught one-on-one by Morse himself, in public no less. I mean, was that more acceptable behavior, or is he being more of a rebel in that sense?
There were two aspects to it. It would have been somewhat rebellious for a woman to try to be a self-supporting professional artist. Most women were required or expected, or at least upper and middle class women were required to get some sort of professional attainments, some artistic skills, playing the piano, music, singing, and also watercolor and other painting was somewhat encouraged. Sculpture, less so. But it was possible for women to get some training, although most of it relied on copying from prints or copying from paintings, and very rarely actually studying the human figure.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Do they still hang paintings like that, one on top of the other?
Not generally. In the 20th century, there became a kind of movement away from that. That was a very European style, and it did happen in the United States, certainly well up into the early 20th century. But then artists like Alfred Stieglitz began in their modernist galleries to try to give each work its own space and to be hung on eye level, because artists had actually complained for many years that part of the problem of in juried exhibitions of exhibiting like that is that the jurors would often put their friends on the line, and that the younger artists who didn't have a reputation ended up being what they called skied, or being sent way up to the ceiling. So it was difficult for younger artists to actually attain any sort of notice in the press if their paintings weren't shown very well. So there was a real movement away from that in the 20th century. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.